Welcome to another CS200 mini lecture. Today we'll talk about JavaFX, which is chapter 18 in your Xi books. Specifically, we'll talk about chapters 18.1 through 18.4. So let's get started. So JavaFX is a set of packages and APIs for us to develop programs using more advanced topics than we saw previously in chapter 17. So we're able to use GUIs, we're able to do 3D graphics, and this makes it for a much more comprehensive user interaction. And let's take a look at some of the components that we need to do the yearly salary. Again, all we're doing is we're printing out a message, much like the first BlueJ example we saw in chapter 17. Let's go to BlueJ and take a look. Since we're just printing out a message to the user, we have a bunch of JavaFX libraries here. And these libraries create an application, we stage, scene, we have a layout pane, and then we have some control over our text field. So with the salary GUI FX, we're extending application. So this provides the basic functionality for the JavaFX program and is available through the import statement. So we have that up here. And the salary GUI FX class is derived from application because that's what we do to extend it. So the class called salary GUI FX inherits all the functionality from the application class so we can display the GUI. Now the main method calls the launch method using the statement launch args, which is down here at the bottom. I want to show you that I cannot run this in BlueJ and then run another program. It gets confused and gives me an error, which I'll show you. And I'll also talk about how you can get around it. Getting around it's not easy because this statement here, this launch args, actually makes it so that we can only launch one per package, not one per class. More about that in a minute. So what we're doing here is we have a method called start, and then we have application stage. So we initialize our variables, and we also create an empty pane, and then we call these scenes. So these are scenes within the pane. So this gives us a little bit of a grid, if you will, or a canvas. So this gives us a bit of a canvas. So here are our calculations for going between an hourly wage and an annual salary or yearly salary. And then we print the message out to the user. We don't want the user to change the text, so we make set editable equal to false. So we can use the set column count 22 to set the width to 22 columns. And then what we do here is we use get children add output field. And so what this does is this is adding graphical components to the scene by adding them to a scene's pane. And again, when you think about a pane, it could be different kinds of graphical components like you'd see on a dashboard. And we call these children. So that's why we have get children. So that adds a text field named output field, and that puts it in the pane's list of children. And then we do set scene, which sets the scene that will be displayed. And the set title method here just puts the title bar message. So that is what we saw in our previous example in chapter 17. And then, of course, to display it, we don't have to go through the 4 steps that we saw last time. We just do show. Let's go ahead and compile this and run it. And you can see it takes a little bit longer to start up. But what it does, and again, we're just doing something very, very simple. So much like we saw last time with salary GUI back in chapter 17, we just print out a title message saying salary, and then a statement that's not changeable by the user that says an hourly wage of $20 an hour yields $40,000 a year. Very simple. Now let me show you if I close this and I try to run this again. Surprisingly, I get an error message, and it comes right back to that statement. You can see here that an application launch must not be called more than once is the error message I get. And initially I thought this was rather cryptic. And the only way around this is to actually close out BlueJ and reopen the same package. So that seems to be the only answer I have found to get around this. So if I close it, and then I open the package again, I'm able to run it. And it appears. I close it, so you can see down here in the lower right-hand corner, I have stopped the process. When I try to do it again, I'm going to get an error message. And if I run another program, I'll also get an error message. So it has to do with issuing the launch more than once. Again, the only way I can figure out around it in BlueJ is to close the project and then open it up again. And then it runs fine. See? So let's take a look at some of the items that we have. We have the application, which is a JavaFX class that we extend. So we inherit the functionality from application. And this provides the basic functionality of the JavaFX GUI. Also, we have a stage. So inside the application, we're developing a canvas. Inside the stage, we have multiple scenes. And then we have panes, which controls the layout. We have a text field, something in which we use to display the message. And these are the components of JavaFX, which we'll see in future programs. So you'll see here we're using a grid pane. What a grid pane is much like chapter 17, where we had a two-dimensional grid of elements. It allows us to position them in the order that we want to. So here's another example. I'm going to go to BlueJ, and we'll take a look at this. It'll look much like what we see here. So now all of a sudden we're importing quite a few more libraries and APIs. We have event handlers, because now instead of just providing information to the screen, we're actually going to be getting information from the user and being able to handle it in a certain way. Some of this is review from chapter 17, but we want to be able to get user input now and be able to calculate the yearly salary. And again, when we talk about the grid pane, you can see we have a two-dimensional. So we have X and Y, and this specifies where it goes on the screen. And you can see we have 5 components. So it's going to be a 2x3 grid on the screen. Again, to handle the event, this is what actually triggers the calculation when we hit the button. So let's go ahead and run this. So here we have an hourly wage that we put in. And what's going to trigger that action is by hitting the calculate button. And so that's what's going to calculate the yearly salary. And let's see if we can go back. We can't. So only the hourly wage can be modified. And you can see here it only expects integers. So if I put a decimal number in, I'm going to get an error. So again, we have not put the right try catch in the block in the code. So that's why we get this. Much like we saw in chapter 17, let's take a look and see what's done at each step. So initially we create this grid. So this grid is created inside of the canvas that we've created. And now we've declared our variables. So these are the initial values that we've set and the types of objects. And next we need to map them to the grid. So this tells us where they go and specifies the location. We would have a continue button. We would have a calculate button on here as well, and that calculate button would go right below yearly salary, if you remember from the example. In the example I just showed you, we used a button, we also had an action event, and we had an event handler. So what that allowed us to do is take some action once a particular item was, or a button was hit. So we would type in the hourly wage, we hit the button, and that would actually trigger the action to occur. So that would be on the set action. And if we had multiple buttons, we'd have to specify each button separately. But this particular set action is the only button, and that's what triggers the calculation to be done and the display to be updated. So again, the action event is what happens when we hit the button. And the event handler is the code that responds to recalculating the yearly salary and updating it and put it to the screen. This would be how we would do it. We could also put something in that says the wages are invalid. Let's go to BlueJ and take a look. So again, here's our code. And this allows us to specify widths. That's what the column count does. We have our button called calculate. We set the padding so we have some space for aesthetics. And then we specify where on the screen the buttons go. So if the hourly wage is greater than 0, we display it. Otherwise, we're going to give an error and saying you can't have a negative wage, and then we're going to wait. So let's take a look and run this. First, we compile it, and then we run it. So we have the hourly wage, so we put 12 in here, and we hit calculate. The action event triggers the calculation and puts this to the screen. But let's just say we put a negative number in here. It's going to give us an error, and we have the message, enter a positive hourly wage. And again, it just waits for us to hit the OK button. Let's just see what happens. If we close it, we get the same effect. So if I put a correct value in, a positive value, it gives me the answer that I would expect. So we have a couple of different kinds of alerts, and these are the pop-up windows that we saw when we put the negative value in. We could just basically not give any error message at all. So that would be the alert type, none. So that's a very basic one. So we can have an alert type error, which displays the red X, and that's already pre-configured. We can do a confirmation, like, are you sure? Information, this just gives information like, we could put something in there saying, this will be calculated using the information you provided, and then a warning. So these give different kinds of icons inside the alert box. But again, compared to creating a window, we don't need to worry about like the grid functions, the panes, and so forth. It just prints a simple message, and we specify that message. So last, we're going to look at basic graphics. And again, very basic graphics in this course. So we can actually create, remember the histogram example? Remember the histogram example that we saw at the beginning of chapter 17? Here we're going to reproduce that, and we're going to go through it step by step and talk about how we do that. Take a look at the code. This is the one that creates those 3 histogram boxes of different colors. Again, we create a pane, we create a scene, and we create a canvas. The canvas, we specify the elements. This is the length and the width. Then we would use this to draw, expand this in 2D. The first one would be olive colored at 1010. The second one would be a rectangle at 1075. And then also specify the width of 200 for the first one, 50 for the height. We specify 150 and 50 for the height of the second one. And then last, we specify a third rectangle, which is gray at 10140, and width is going to be longer for the same height. And notice here we specify a color in RGB format, and then we set fill on that color. Now, why would we do that? We could do this certainly in one step, but the nice thing about this is it's a little bit more self-explanatory. If I come back and I'm looking at this code later, I know that I can just change bin color 3 to react to certain events, for example. If I have this set as setting the color RGB and not using the variable, I can still follow it. It's still logical, but unfortunately, it's just a little bit harder to understand. So that's why they call this setting of the RGB values, and they set that to a color variable. And that's why they set it to a color variable. So again, we set the title, we set the scene, right? So we have set scene, and set scene is going to set the scene, and that's going to put the pane in place, and then we actually display the window using this show. Inside of our main, all we're doing is we have launch and then we pass the args. In this case, we don't have any. Again, anytime we have something like this, we can have it once per project. Compile it. It doesn't come across in the compile. It only comes across when you run it. So again, we get histogram viewer, which is the title we selected. The boxes, we've got different colors here. We've got different lengths. And we've done this all on our own. So this is a very basic introduction to graphics and a very basic introduction to JavaFX. Again, please play around with this if you have an interest in graphics and you have an interest in working with the user in terms of a graphical user interface. These two chapters, chapters 17 and 18, where we talk about GUI and JavaFX, are the ones in which we set the foundation for what you would do anytime you want to interact with the user in a more sophisticated way.